Our agenda for today's event is pretty straightforward. Following this welcome by myself, I will pass over to my colleague David Powell, who will then introduce our main speaker, Dan Neely. Dan will chat for I guess 30 to 40 minutes. There will be an opportunity midway for one or two questions, but after Dan's main presentation, we will then have a good amount of time for a question and answer session. And we will obviously take questions via the chat function, but ideally we prefer if people come off camera and mute, and you can verbalize your own question to Dan. Before handing over to David, this is really just highlighting some dates for your diaries in terms of two upcoming webinars. We still have to disseminate the details, but just to let you know that next month on the 14th of June, we're proposing a webinar on artificial intelligence and societal resilience. Then the month after, in July, on the 9th of July, we're proposing a webinar on leading in societal resilience. We will be bringing those details together over the next couple of weeks. So I think if you're not already following us and connecting with us via LinkedIn, please do so, and I will pop that link into the chat after. Please do so, so that obviously you're up to date in terms of events and when they're happening. Please also then check out obviously our partners in relation to the webinar series, the RBOC project network. You can obviously see the website there. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass over to David, and while David is introducing Dan, then Dan will be able to share slides. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Welcome, everybody. Good to see everybody again online. And thank you. Welcome to our guest, Dan Neely from the Wellington Regional Emergency Management Office in New Zealand. Dan, what time is it over where you are?
Good evening, everybody. It's 8 p.m.
Well, thanks for agreeing to come and do it at this time in your evening and this time in our morning. Great to see you again, Dan. I mean, I think most people online probably understand from our previous webinars, Dan, that we've been very much inspired by what you've been doing over in New Zealand. And in particular, I think the philosophy behind the model. I, Duncan, have been having a number of chats over recent months about some of the background thinking. And in particular, your thoughts on what this all might mean about how we restructure, how we deliver emergency management, for example, to ensure we can deliver community resilience is what really got us very interested in what you were doing. So really grateful that you've agreed to join us in your evening to share some of your experience at first hand, rather than us always talking about it at second hand. So rather than keep you up any later, Dan, I think the best thing for me to do is hand over to you. And I know you're going to introduce yourself in a little bit more detail anyway. So my thanks to you on a personal level. And yeah, look forward to hearing from you. Thanks, Dan.
Right on. Thank you, David. Kia ora koutou katoa. My name is Daniel Neely. I am the Manager of Community Resilience and the Group Recovery Manager at the Wellington Regional Emergency Management Office. As you can probably hear from my accent, I am not a New Zealander by birth, but I've been here for about 17 years. I'm originally from Arizona in the United States. And I guess the other element to that is I always introduce myself as a community development person who does work in emergency management. I've been in this space for about almost 25 years now. And what I really try to do alongside of the amazing group of people that I work with in my team is really try to bring a community development perspective, bottom-up approach to the emergency management sector to make sure that we're kind of complementing that traditional top-down command control mindset. So with that, I'll just maybe just dive into our little presentation. And this is actually a presentation that I gave at a big meeting about 4 months ago to our regional managers of emergency management across the country. And it was really on the same lines of enabling a better, faster, and safer community response. And so it's going to be a little bit New Zealand focused, and I'll try to maybe modify that a little bit. But you can also see the lens, I'm sure, through everything we're talking about, through where you're living, wherever that may be. And I'm opening up really what I did at this conference where I presented at was really opened up and looking for disagreement, not to the point of arguing, but to really understand exactly where the audience at that time might be having some hesitations around the community response. And so I'm going to walk you through a few premises later on, and like Andrew said, we might pause for a few minutes, just take a few questions, but I'm going to put it to you for consideration around what are the parts that I offer up for as examples that you might disagree with. So I'm going to open up with really a story from one of my best friends in the world named Chris, who is born and raised in Maui, Hawaii, on the island of Maui. And he's from this little place called Kihei, right here, circled in the red dot. And you guys might remember this, around this time last year, where there was a big fire in Lahaina. And the reason I'm opening up with is Chris ended up becoming part of this big community response that we're often talking about. So this is the picture of Lahaina before and after. You might remember it was a huge event at a suburb level. There's about 12,500 people, as I understand it, live in Lahaina. They all had to evacuate the very last minute. And it became a community response for about 3 days. And what really stuck with me from this example is for 3 days there was almost no official response on the ground. Chris described it as people just coming from all over the island, emptying out grocery stores and Costco, this big kind of supermarket, and really mobilizing to look after this affected community when there just wasn't anything on the ground from FEMA. No, there wasn't a big state capacity. Despite Pearl Harbor being just 30 minutes, flight away, there just wasn't any official response. Nobody really showed up until day 4, and really things didn't get going until day 5. But people came out of the woodwork to support each other, and it was messy, but there was structure that started taking shape. Chris described it as this down the shopping center, which is the picture in the bottom left-hand corner. It took a couple days, but once people started finding a common place to match those needs and offers, the community was doing an amazing job. And that started very quickly right after the fires had subsided. And so there's plenty of examples. That's Chris's personal story and the quote that he gave me. The community provided everything for the first few days, and it scaled on the 3rd day when we organized ourselves at the nearby shopping center. We didn't see any meaningful government support until the 5th day. And there's a lot of news articles. Obviously, I wasn't there, but it really speaks to some of the challenges that the official response was able to serve those communities that were affected. And at the same time, this article just came out of Australia. This is from the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and an article called "Anarchy in the Yuki," and that's a section. That's an area up in Australia, and they just talked about how the official capacity for response was very quickly outstripped, and the demands placed on that were just far exceeded what the ability of the system was able to provide. And some of the quotes that came out of that article, and it's definitely worth reading if you come across it, you can dig it up online, that after those initial challenges of setting up the processing, coordinating those resources and provisions, the community hub that they had set up became much more orderly, right? So just like if you work in the emergency management space, it's always messy at the beginning. It's no different for communities, but they self-organize and start servicing those needs. The arrival of the Australian Defence Force nearly 2 weeks after the flood lifted morale, but the part that really stuck with me is it wasn't, they weren't there for a couple of weeks. And throughout this presentation, I want to really stress it's not about the capability of the emergency management system. It's often about the capacity can't meet the demands, right? So the Yuki Hub worked with a loose structure, and decision-making was fast and fluid and on the fly. And they likened it to that anarchistic alliance. And I like that because it was quite loose. But regardless, the people of that community came together and supported each other. And that's not unique to that, right? This has happened in multiple experiences over New Zealand over the last decade. Some of you might remember the Christchurch earthquake from 2011. One of the defining stories out of that is the Student Volunteer Army, 3,000 students that came out of the woodwork to help mobilize and solve people's problems. The Nelson fires in 2019, it was a big, massive fire at the top of the South Island. We had an official civil defense center set up. That we had about 10, 12 people going through that a day. However, the community had set up with about 300 or 400 volunteers, and they were servicing 1,000 people a day. And the same thing as we went into COVID-19, Maori, who are the indigenous people of New Zealand, within the first couple of days had set these amazing logistics chains, and they were looking after their people, while those of us in the official system, I was actually seconded into central government, we were struggling just to get after action reports out, or sorry, action reports out. So while the official system sometimes takes time to scale up, the community is always going to be there, and that's right around the world, right? These are just events that we see all over the world. So I guess the first premise I opened up with at that conference was, does anyone disagree with this premise that communities quickly repurpose their capacity and self-organize to support one another in an emergency? And nobody disagreed with that. Nobody disagreed with this one either, that the official emergency management system cannot control what people do in a response. And I think, I'm not quite sure how the structures work where you live, but I think one of the things we sometimes get confused about is if we go into a state of emergency, and that's what SOE is, whether we go into a state of emergency, whether we have powers, regardless, the emergency management cannot control what people do. We can stop some people doing some things for some limited amount of time, but we can't control what people do. If people want to go and start doing stuff, they're often going to do that whether we like it or not. The next piece I raised is, this is from the United States. It's the billion-dollar events starting from 1980 to 2021, and you can see a really sharp rise starting in 2005, coincidentally maybe, with Hurricane Katrina in the United States. And you can probably see in that graph, there's a lot more green and a lot more blue graphs starting to kind of take shape from 2005 onwards. That's flooding and severe storm counts, right? So the next premise was really, does anybody disagree with this? That scientists globally agree that climate change is increasing, and the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events and those impacts will continue to worsen in the future. And I'm not sure if anybody's disagreeing yet out there. I'm really happy to open it up to the floor, but nobody seemed to disagree with that. This premise is a picture of what is likely to be what we call a Hikarangi subduction zone earthquake event. That'll be a massive earthquake, recognizing that we've got some really big risks in New Zealand, maybe not the same types of hazardscape that you have in the UK, but regardless of the size of an event, if it's big enough, people will come together and start supporting each other. But the premise here is, we have a 1 in 4 chance of a magnitude 8 or greater earthquake in the next 50 years, and a 75% probability of the Alpine Fault, which is on the South Island, occurring in the next 50 years. And of course, nobody really disagreed with that because that's pretty common knowledge here in New Zealand. The final piece really was this one is, we just went a little over a year ago, we had a giant cyclone hit the east coast of the country, and there's quite a big number of reviews, and this is a big news article that came out with a bunch of different quotes, and I'll just read through some of these. What this really highlights, again, is not about capability. It's not that anybody did anything wrong, is that for a decent sized event, there is just such limited capacity in the system, right? So as the stuff, the red highlighted wording is really the stuff to focus on. Firefighters were scrambling to find vehicles and enough communication planning staff for air support. We had to spend the last day and a half scouring New Zealand for 4 rental utes, which is a truck, for the Northern Urban Search and Rescue teams. And so far, we've drawn a blank, right? This line, they literally, our national ops were looking for trailers at the local service stations. And that our New Zealand Defence Force, NZDF, said it could take 1 or 2 people per MOG and gear, but New Zealand Defence Force's resources are extremely stretched, FENS was told, and FENS is Fire Emergency New Zealand. And finally, the National Coordination Center, the NCC, sent out a call on Saturday just to, quote unquote, try and drum up interest to cover vacant roles in planning, intelligence, and logistics. Again, I just want to really reiterate, this is not about the people that were in that event. We have amazing people doing amazing work and did everything that they possibly could with very limited capacity. And so my premise here was New Zealand does not have enough capacity in the official emergency management system to effectively manage much more than a low-level event for several days. We have a scale of 1 to 4 on our categories of emergency events in New Zealand. Cyclone Gabriel was a level 2, and we were pretty stretched at that. And I guess I offer that to wherever you live. How much capacity is in the official system to solve those problems. And that's why I very much opened up with my friend Chris's story, because as an American, America has a lot of stuff. There's plenty of things that are interesting about America, pros and cons, but America has a lot of resources. And if the United States couldn't get its resources to a suburb level event on an island, which is still a state, until day 4 of an event, that is something to kind of, and from what I was kind of raising in New Zealand anyways, we're also an island nation, but we've only got 5 million people and not a lot of resources. So what does that tell us about the capacity of the official system? And so there's a few if-then statements here. If communities self-organize to support each other in emergencies, and the emergency management cannot control what people do during a disaster response, and climate change is creating bigger and more frequent hazardous events, and there is a high-risk catastrophic earthquake in our lifetime that's going to probably happen, at least, again, unique to New Zealand, and New Zealand does not have enough capacity in the official system to effectively manage much more than a low-level event for several days. If all those things are true, then what I was really putting to the people in the room, these decision makers, is, does anybody disagree with this premise that we need to think differently about how we structure our emergency management system to meet the increasing demands of the future? I delivered this back in October. We've had several reviews of the cyclone response, and what's interesting is just a few weeks ago, this was the headline for the big government review, is that the emergency management system is, interestingly, quote unquote, not fit for purpose. So the date on that is, I think, April 23rd. So that is, in many respects, I guess, the questions that we have been raising, we've identified coming out of the Christchurch earthquake 12 years ago, and we've been very deliberately trying to rethink how does the emergency management system work when we think about a whole of society response. And so our premise, I guess, going forward is the philosophy and the ethos out of the Wellington Region Emergency Management Office is everyone in society is an emergency manager. And by that, I mean everybody. Everybody has something to give, whether it be from the head, the heart, or the hands. Everybody is an emergency manager, and we all solve problems every day. And I go back, this has become one of my favorite slides recently to talk about emergency management, because we basically evolved as a species to deal with emergencies, right? So whoever it was that went up to Siberia and tried to cross a land bridge, they dealt with emergencies every day and had to figure out how to get food and shelter, and all that is going on in that picture on the left. The Maori and the Polynesians who crossed the Pacific on canoes, like, also dealt with amazing emergencies every day and dealt with it, right? They managed those emergencies. So there's nothing inherently unique about emergency management and the skill sets that are part of emergency management. Our premise is that everybody is, solving emergencies every day. And that is, if you get a flat tire, you go through the same planning process of, okay, I got to go do some options analysis, whether it's fix the flat tire, call a cab, call an Uber, call a friend, whatever the case, walk to work. People solve emergencies every day. And a disaster and emergency event presents a whole different set of different challenges that people go through and solve those challenges in a pretty common way as well. So I'm going to just illustrate what I mean a little bit, where I think the evolution of our sector, at least in New Zealand, can't speak for where you're at, but I know when I started working here 15 years ago, I think as a community development person working in a very operational environment, I think we were really good about coming up with org charts and structure and putting plans in place. And historically, we've talked about the community response as messy and, quote unquote, something over there that needs to be managed, that spontaneous volunteers are doing risky stuff and need to be managed, and they're not safe. And we just really challenged that whole premise. What Christchurch, I think, was a real eye-opening moment for us here in New Zealand was that community capacity is far greater than the official system. And again, come back to the Hawaii example and a whole bunch of other examples out there, the community response, while be it messy, self-organizes pretty quickly and starts to solve problems. We have had a disconnect between that official kind of closed system approach and the messy community response. And what we have really tried to work toward the last several years is how do you integrate it? Because they're really quite interdependent systems, right? We are there to serve our communities, and our communities, in many respects, rely on us to have a lot of their needs met that maybe that community response can't solve. And so what we try to do is really deliberately bring those together. And the way that we've done that is to move to a place-based model in every suburb called community emergency hubs. And so community emergency hubs are, just like it says on the tin right there, a place for communities to gather and help each other during an emergency. And that is without any government support. And so I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a framework of what that looks like for us. The way that that has been built is with the way we frame it is it is a genuinely integrated emergency management system that better enables and supports the community-led response. So it's not like we've never done it, but this allows it to be better, faster, safer. And that's kind of our mantra when it comes to this. So what we do know, and I'm sure it's, again, not dissimilar wherever you're at, as soon as an emergency event happens, people generally try to go to their home, they check on their household, they often meet the neighbor, they go, often check on the neighbors that they know and like. And then what often happens is people start pouring out into the streets. They end up catching up with maybe the people that they've lived next door to for 15 years but never talked to, or the neighbors that they don't really like. And then what we have done is insert a community emergency hub model at every suburb level or neighborhood, however it's framed, where people can then go to match needs and offers. So if they need some assistance or they can offer some assistance within 30 minutes of walking distance, that's where they can go. Each of our hubs then are connected to our emergency operations center, and each of our emergency operations center within each city is that. And then we have a connection to our emergency coordination center and our emergency operations centers. And that, of course, is connected to national level. So what this does is it really connects right from the household right up to the official top level emergency management system. And that makes it more integrated. The piece to really hit home for us is that hub is not part of the official emergency management system. So we help set them up. I'm going to walk you through shortly how that is facilitated, but it is not part of the official system. We don't direct people to go do stuff, and I can get into some of that in the Q&A later. But it's all about channeling the energy of community, pushing them to a common point where they can work together instead of running around their neighborhood, trying to match needs and offers. There's a common point for people to problem solve. And I just come back again to that Hawaii example where it took them a couple days, but once they landed at that local mall, they had a better ability to start connecting with each other, right? Matching those needs and offers. So this is a map of our hubs across the Wellington region. We have 128 of them right now. And again, that's generally at a suburb level. Nobody should have, no household should have to walk more than 30 minutes to be able to access their hubs. Sometimes we do that planning in individual, like when it's more isolated rural areas. Sometimes they're more bunched up when we've done that planning. So what I'm going to do now is actually walk you through the planning that my team has developed to go about developing community emergency hubs. And before I get into that, and I'm going to talk about this right at the end, coming back to community development models and theories and practices and methodologies, this is all based on what's called a strength-based model. So first and foremost, we like to always have fun. We have a party, so we never kind of go in and talk about death and destruction. We always talk about how communities are going to work together in times of stress and how people are going to really support each other, right? So it's a much more positive frame. We always have food because it's an opportunity to build social capital and neighbors to meet neighbors. And if there's the one thing to focus on when it comes to emergency preparedness is building social capital, and the evidence base is really strong there. So my team will spend some time in a suburb. We kind of organize these events for people to come together, and we run them through kind of 3 steps. And the first one is we ask, why do you love this place where you live? And people were given 2 Post-it notes, and we'd say, scribble down 2 things you love. And often people would stand up and go, I didn't come here to talk about community stuff. I came here to talk about how we're going to respond. And we'd say, bear with us. I hear you. Bear with us. Just give us 2 things that you love about this community. And my team in the back would be creating a word cloud live, basically, as that stuff was coming in. And we'd show it to them all, within a couple minutes. And honestly, you'd see people tear up because they'd have that kind of moment of realization that this is why they're responding. It's not to respond, it's to protect the things and the people that they love. And so that was a very much of an anchoring exercise of to why we're doing this. And then we move on to the next two steps. And this is based on what's called asset-based community development. And if you're not familiar with that, it is kind of a strengths-based approach where you focus on what a community has, not what they need. So one of the things that we often do in government is we go into a community, it's like, oh, what's wrong in this community? What do they need to solve the problem? And that's what's called deficit-based problem solving, right? You're starting from a place of need, not from a place of what they already have to solve problems. And every community is rich in resources if we give them the opportunity to kind of showcase that and unpack it and explore it. And so my team would go in and we'd start with what are the resources in this community. We'd have a giant, huge, couple maps and some sticky notes, and we just let people run with it. We give them a bit of a framework. Who are the groups and networks? What are the places and spaces? What are the services and businesses and infrastructure? And all those little sticky dots get a number attached to them. And then we do the same thing. What are the vulnerabilities? What are the is there a retirement community here that might need to be looked after, or is there a bridge that or a road that might get more washed out than normal, whatever the case may be. And again, those red dots are the things that get tagged and labeled. All of that gets tagged into our community emergency hub guide, and that is very much around. It took us a while to figure out the simplicity of this, but the hub guide, and we can go through this a little bit later, is not a plan. It is a framework to improvise on for people who have never really thought about community emergency response planning before, because we know that under stress, the human brain goes like this, and it doesn't think wide and creatively. So it becomes basically a bank of ideas for people to draw on in times of stress. And so we've got you can't really probably see this very well, but there's just a whole bunch of lists of ideas that the community generates. Same thing from a vulnerability point of view. And so they go through all those different areas. And then the final bit of the exercise that evening, that's asset-based community development. The final bit of the evening is we get up there and we go, okay, how would you solve these 5 challenges without any official government support? And we hit it home. Like, you get nothing from government. You get nothing from local government. You get nothing from police. You get nothing from fire. You get nothing from health. And you see people's face melt a little bit because they're like, oh, what do you mean? We're like, if for us, for, decent size event, that's where we're kind of been, framing it as, you're not going to get that. You're not going to get that big. Don't expect to get the support you want because they'll be stretched. And you see people go through a real kind of almost like the stages of grief real fast. And within a couple of minutes, they're like, okay, what do we got to do to problem solve? And so then we basically run them through, how would you solve these 5 challenges: rescue, medical, shelter, water, and food? How would you solve these without any government support? And then people get really into it at this stage. Now they're getting really creative. And so we give them a bit of a framework. Here's water. And then we just ask some questions. Where are you going to find drinking water in your community? If you can't, if the taps aren't working, where are you going to find it? And because I don't know what you guys know about Wellington, New Zealand, but we have a brewery on every street corner. So, there's a lot of big brew tanks floating around in every suburb. Where can we find water, et cetera, et cetera? So across those 5 common challenges, we are giving people the space to come up with creative ideas that they can improvise on in a response. Each of those solutions is unique to the community. So we have 128 hubs, and 128 of these are unique, that have all been driven by community. That goes into chapter 5 of your community's response. The other piece as a design challenge that we were really trying to figure out was, how do we get people who have never trained together but are capable problem solvers and emergency managers, we talked about earlier, how do we help them work as a team? And so one of my team came up with this really creative idea. Why don't we just give them job descriptions that they can hang around their neck? And so instead of kind of having vests, we were trying to find a balance between the official kind of structures that we use in emergency management while also making it more informal. And so we came up with color-coded lanyards that people with job descriptions that people could hang around their neck. And that was just a stroke of brilliance. And you can see all this. I meant to put this on here. You can see a lot of this on our website at WREMO, WREMO.NZ/community. A lot of this content is there, so you can look at it in more detail. And basically, a community emergency hub is nothing more than a plastic box with a whole bunch of those job descriptions. You can see those in the picture there. Some copies of a hub guide and a whole bunch of different types of stationery and maps that the community could use to basically coordinate the response. So the community emergency hub is not by itself like what we say is kind of a welfare center or emergency evacuation center. It is a place for people to coordinate using those assets that are all around them in their community. And somebody said, yeah, there you go. Thank you. And the second piece to that is what goes on the outside of all of our hubs is a sign that I showed you earlier that basically identifies it as a hub. And it says a descriptor, this is the place where communities come together and basically solve emergencies. We went through the process of looking at hardening these buildings, and we made the very good decision in hindsight, which was if the building is damaged for whatever reason, the hub is just a common point that everybody knows. You can put up a sign that says, actually, we've moved from Thorndon School to St. Mark's Church down the road, and you can take all that kit and drive everybody to that location. So the hub model is not based on trained volunteers; it's based on emergent volunteers, people that could just show up and become, those community leaders out of nowhere that you just don't expect. It's about people coming together to match needs and offers to coordinate their response. This is a picture we had one of our local imams actually go through this planning, and he requested that the local mosque actually become a community emergency hub for two reasons. One, he was really adamant that they're not just going to be serving the Muslim community in times of stress. The mosque is there for everybody. And I think what was really interesting is they also recognized that they wanted to open it up because people were curious of what was going on in the mosque, and it was a way for them to better integrate themselves in the community, to let people come into the mosque and meet them, right? So I think that was a twofold move there, and I think it's just a neat story. All of that was theory, though, up until 2020. So we rolled this out. I should have said we rolled this out in 2017, and or 2016 in Southland, which is the south of New Zealand. That's one of those southernmost region. It's the southernmost region of New Zealand. They adopted the model from us in 2018, and in 2020 they had a big giant flood. I mean, it was a real huge flood, and they ended up having 26 community emergency hubs activated and led by more than 1,000 emergent volunteers. None of which had any training, none of them which were affiliated really to the emergency management system. And this is a picture of one of the hubs with a local pastor. So one of the theories that we'd gone into that is people will gravitate to the roles they're comfortable with, and that yellow one is the hub supervisor. And fittingly, that hub pastor led his congregation every day, right? So he was pretty comfortable being in a leadership position. And in times of stress, he reached out and said, hey, you know what? We can do this. He grabbed the hub supervisor role. Everybody kind of tipped in as appropriate, and they were one of the 26 success stories for that event. I was there because I'm part of the National Emergency Response Team, and so I happened to be down there for that event. And in my 15 years of working a lot of emergency events, to this day, that is the smoothest response that I've ever been a part of. And the reason why it was so smooth is because the welfare desk, and these are all incident management roles that we describe here, that welfare desk was literally just on the phone to each hub, just basically going, hub A, what do you need? You need some X, Y, and Z? Cool, we'll get you some X, Y, and Z. Hub B, what do you guys need? We'll get you some X, Y, and Z, right? So it became much more of a targeted logistics exercise of getting them the resources that they need. High trust was built because we trust you to do this. That's what you need, we'll get it to you. So the effort, went into getting targeted support to targeted communities based on what they were requiring. It built trust really high with the emergency management system in the community, which, if you've been around, that's something that often gets fumbled along the way. And it allowed what was a very limited capacity to really focus on those that needed it that we weren't able to kind of pick up a phone call to and support. So it was to this day, it's the smoothest response I've ever seen. And in huge part, anybody that was part of that event will say it's because of the hub model. So where we're at now is we've done the planning across the whole of the region. All of our entire region has this. It took us a few years, but the whole region has it. Now what we do is we call them community emergency practice sessions. And this is just a recent one we do where what we do is we kind of do the same process. We advertise it. Everybody is an emergency manager. You are capable. You don't need any training to do this. Come learn how you're going to work with your community in times of stress when we have an emergency event. And there'll be food and it's a party, et cetera, et cetera. And this is one that we just recently ran in Alfredo Bay. I'm just going to play this video. This is our deputy mayor, Lori of Wellington City, Lori Foon. She just participated, and I'm just going to share her observations. Seeing there's no sound.
And I think we're hearing it, Dan. You know, even
So what we do, so that's our deputy mayor. We have quite a number of our elected officials participate in these things. They generally really like it. It's a great opportunity for them to be with their community, show some leadership, take hazards importantly. And what we do with the practice sessions is we do that advertising. Again, we always have a party. In this instance, it was tied to a local Halloween party where people were all dressed up. So that was also another fun dynamic. And what we do is whoever shows up, we basically split the group in half. So half are given roles of community members needing help or wanting to offer help. And it's amazing when you give people an opportunity to do some fun role-playing acting, they will just generally go crazy with it. And then the other half are given a hub kit without any instruction whatsoever. And they're told, you have 10 minutes to set up this hub. And they say, what are we supposed to do? Can somebody guide us through it? And we say, everything's in the kit. You have to figure it out because we're not going to be here. And again, you see their face melt for about 30 seconds and then they dive into it. And you can see some of the acting that's taking place there. It is hilarious and fun and chaotic. And what often happens is about 15 minutes of just general chaos, just like if you ever worked in an emergency operations center. But people quickly start to develop the rhythm. So they set up the hub, they go around, they grab the lanyards, they start identifying the jobs that need to get done. And then we stop at about, we usually stop about 30 minutes in once they start to get a feel for it, and we let them split. And then the second time, when they split and do the opposite roles, then it's just like as smooth as silk. And it's amazing to watch people. And it's always really reaffirming to see how people kind of go into these practice sessions thinking, I can't do this. And they walk away really capable, or I mean, they're already capable, but like really confident. And some of the best feedback I've gotten over the years, and I've had it a few times now, which is, why do we even have you guys? We can do this ourselves. And that's like the best, that's like the absolute pinnacle thing that people can say, right? Because they're basically saying, we don't even need the emergency management system. We've got this. I don't think it's that simple. There's more to it than that. But the fact that they're walking away feeling so confident in their capabilities and their community to look after each other just after one practice session is quite game changing. So that's kind of where the model is being currently rolled out. I think it's a bit more coverage than that, but most of New Zealand now by population I think in Vancouver they've kind of taken a version and modified it, and so same thing in different parts of Australia starting to roll out. That's a great line by my buddy Brendan too, who's emergency management here. He's from Christchurch, and they've gone through some really big events, and they've adopted it. And he's highlighted there's a direct correlation between post-disaster experience and embracing an improved model. They are huge fans of this because they have the lived experience, know how important. So, a couple common questions and concerns. There's a legal risk to hubs. We don't have the capacity to roll this out. Why bother when hubs when communities already self-organize their response? This concept just wouldn't work in our region because any number of things. It would only work in New Zealand because you guys have big events there. We've actually seen it rolled out now. We've had it in place for quite a while. Excuse me, I need some water. And it's been used in quite a number of small events increasingly. We're starting to see it. We just had it rolled out about 2 months ago for a local fire, and the community immediately have activated very small scale response, but they really took a lot of pride in the fact that they were able to come together, and consequently local council didn't need to set up an emergency welfare center. So it was a win. I'm just going to close with a couple more slides on the importance. So that's the model. The how is just as important of the what, right? So the model is the what. The how it's implemented, I actually think is even more important. And I introduced myself as a community development person who works in emergency management very deliberately, because the skills that are required to roll this out are in the community development space, not in the emergency management space. So anybody you're going to make sure doing this work needs to have a foundation in community development theory, methodologies, and practice before sending them out into the wild. And so I never let any new hires in my team go out and do this type of work until they've really built a good foundation. I'm just going to share a quick reason as to why. So back in 1998, Hurricane Mitch blew through Central America and right over Honduras, and it was the third biggest hurricane ever recorded. I believe it took the lives of nearly 20,000 people, displaced 1 million, and destroyed 70% of the roading networks in Honduras. Honduras is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere at that stage. So it was just an immense blow to that country. I was a Peace Corps volunteer that arrived not long after that. I don't know if you're familiar with Peace Corps, but it's young idealistic Americans often get sent to these different countries, and there's a whole lot around that as well. But I spent a little over 2 years doing disaster recovery related work in Honduras. And right when I arrived, like a lot of people that want to make a difference and go big, I identified the problem of trash was a problem in many parts of Honduras, and I realized I could solve this problem, right? So I identified the problem, and I got funding to build these trash cans, and I designed the trash cans, and I painted the trash cans, and I found the layout across my village to put those trash cans in place, and I found where the trash could be dumped, and I did all this great work, and to this day I maintained it was I did some really good work. However, it was a complete failure. Nobody used those trash cans, and I not long after it was rolled out, I saw this dog taking a crap next to one of my trash cans, and I thought it was a really good, I thought it was a really good metaphor for the failure that I had rolled out through this project. And it was such a good learning experience because, as you probably picked up, I'm the one that identified the problem. I identified the solution. I project managed the solution. I did everything. I didn't really involve the community in this project. And that is I see that time and again from government, and it's something that if you are going to get into this work, it's got to be meaningful, and you got to put the how of methodologies behind this to do it well. And so how we engage matters. If you walk away with anything from this presentation, it's that how we engage our communities really matters. Time and again, we can do the best stuff in the world, like I did a good job, but how I did it was such an abysmal failure that that project never had a chance of succeeding, and I railroaded the community that I was trying to help along the way. So I'm going to share 2 slides with you, and I encourage you to write this down and go watch this video on YouTube. Jim Deere's 7 Principles of Asset-Based Community Development is pretty much everything you need to know about community development in less than 8 minutes. Jim Deeres is an incredibly inspirational community development practitioner, and he just touches on the importance of having fun and making sure that we recognize that everybody has something to give in society, and it's fantastic. We've actually transcribed that. We review it regularly as a team just to make sure that we're on point, and if there's anything we're doing or not doing that isn't kind of aligned with that, just to make sure we're doing the best work we can for our communities. And some of the things that I've rolled out over the years that my team is basically required to kind of go through before they're allowed to go out in the wild is things like improv comedy, which sounds like a weird thing to roll out in emergency management. But if you're familiar with improv comedy, that idea of yes and, that you can never say no, right? Second you say no, you stop a conversation from progressing. So yes and, listening techniques, indigenous knowledge is really important, obviously in New Zealand. Design thinking is critical. It's a great problem-solving methodology. Appreciative inquiry, again, more of an asset-based approach. Storytelling, like we don't move people with data. We move people with human stories, right? Behavioral psychology, all these things, co-design principles, these are all the elements that if you're going to go out and do this work or have a team that goes and do this work, have that foundation in community development before you go out. So that's my presentation, and we're really happy to share resources with any interested cities. And thank you very much for really taking the time to participate and listen. I'm really keen to hear some good questions. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Dan. Really, really great. Thanks for generously sharing your time with the presentation. As my camera is still waking up, yeah, sorry, I'm less blurred now. But yeah, we've obviously had some fantastic comments and supportive comments coming through the chat. There are also a couple of questions in the chat. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, ideally, people will come off mute and come off camera in terms of verbalizing their own question. But in order to do that, it would be great if obviously people began to raise their hands, so that then I can enable your mics and your microphone and your cameras. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and I would hopefully come to them first of all, if amenable. So Becky Maynard, I wonder if you could maybe raise your hand, Becky, just so I can see where you are, and then I can enable your microphone and camera, and then it would be fantastic, Becky, if you were able to then say the question that you presented in the chat for Dan. Thank you.
Hi, Dan, thanks. I mean, that was absolutely fantastic. And it seems like an absolute no-brainer. Why are we not all doing this? But so my role is with the voluntary sector and coordination, and I've got a particular interest in spontaneous volunteer management and some of the challenges that poses. And one of the things that I find is we get a real pushback from particularly local authorities in wanting to manage and mobilise the voluntary sector, and it always seems to come back down to, right, who's liable, who's who's covered by which insurance, and that seems to be a real challenge in terms of us mobilising the equivalent of these hubs, which, as I say, seems like an absolute no-brainer and just a fantastic concept. So I'd love to know how that works in New Zealand and potentially in Hawaii and the other areas where you've operated.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is kind of the central, it's such a good question. So thank you. I think traditionally we have looked at how do we manage and task spontaneous volunteers. Interestingly, I think there's liability risk associated with that, right? Whereas with the hub model, where we have evolved in the way we work with our controllers and our emergency operation teams is it's about channeling the energy, right? So people are going to do whatever they're going to do. And that's why that's one of those premises, right? Like we are not going to stop them. What we can do, instead of saying, I want you to do this or not do this, and here's the tools to do it, and here's the safety briefing, and here we're going to register your skills. If you think about it from an outcome point of view, you can basically get the same outcome by sharing intelligence with the community that says, people are meeting down on the beach in Island Bay to do storm cleanup, and if you want to help, people are coordinating their efforts at their local community emergency hub. Like, we can share that with the community, right? People can make up their own mind what they want to do. You could even share information on social media that says, here's some good safety guidance if you're doing X, Y, and Z. But we're not tasking anybody. We're not managing those people, right? And if you think about it, like, why do we need to insert ourselves into that when in many respects we can channel the energy of the communities to get that same outcome. And that's kind of where we've moved to. So instead of developing that bringing a bunch of people that we don't really know, we don't know these people, we can basically get the same outcome by just channeling the energy and sharing intelligence with them through the EOC to either the general public or to the Community Emergency Hub. Does that answer that question?
Kind of. The only thing I would come back on is that you talk about training, educating people, but not tasking them. But if you're providing a hub facility that includes a lanyard that has got a specific task on it or a specific role, I think my concern is that people would see that as tasking, and therefore there's a liability potentially involved in that.
Yeah. So for us, that is gifted to the community. We gift it.
Okay.
Right. So so that's why I make a real point in that presentation. This is not part of the official emergency management system. So we facilitate that in the same way that your local council gives households garbage cans. This is often the example I use. We give stuff to people all the time. If a bunch of kids were to jump in a wheelie bin garbage can and roll down the street and get hurt, like that's not council's responsibility, right? So in the same way, we gift this. We do the training with people pre-event, and it's not so much, I shouldn't use the word training, we call it practice sessions. We don't specifically tell people exactly how to do it or even how to do it. We let them practice, and what's going to be is what's going to be. And it's not specific taskings, it's here's the things that need to get done. So it's the what needs to get done, but not the how.
Thanks, Dan. That's fantastic. And thank you for a really fantastic presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky. So I say that Chris, you have your hand raised, but before I come to you, I wonder, Ian Randell has a comment or a question in the chat. So Ian, I've also enabled your camera and microphone. So if you're willing to then verbalize what you put in the chat, go ahead, and then we'll come to Chris.
Yeah, sure. One of the first things that people want to know during an emergency is, are my friends and family and friends safe? So is there a role for the hubs to facilitate this?
Yeah, so there's an information board role. And so where people can come in and basically post questions or share information of what we know. So where we are moving to is we currently have phone numbers. The EOC has a connection to each hub. And so that is part of our connection to be able to share that, share intel as openly and transparently as possible with our communities. We have a number of pathways to do that, either through phones, if they're operable, through VHF radio, and increasingly we're looking at rolling out Starlink across the whole of the region at each hub. So if the entire grid were to go down, we actually have a pathway that we've been developing, which is pretty exciting. That'll be inside of the hub, and it's a QR code that people can use their own phone, and it takes to the back end of our website where there's a plain English situation report sitting on the back of our website. That plain English sit rep gets completed on a phone and sent to the Intel desk, and you have a connection there right from the hub to the EOC. So the hub can get official information, and that can be shared with the community, and the community can also use their own local information. I'm looking for Bob or Susan or whatever the case, and there's an information function just for that very purpose. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and does that include damage assessments as well?
To an extent, right? There's a couple little things that we're actually looking at. How do you do really simplified without overcomplicating things? Because it's all driven by community members, right? So that is part of our real simple, plain English situation report on the back side of our website that's going to be connected to the hubs in the near future. And we just have some real simple questions that we're asking community. Yeah, we have a little bit of a framework for it.
And just one last question, because I don't want to hog things. Do you get the hubs to offer what works well and what hasn't worked well?
As in kind of reviews afterwards? What do you mean?
Yeah, post-incident reviews and things like that.
We do it informally. As more of my team, I have a community development team basically that's out there, so they get that kind of feedback. But we don't do kind of formal after action reviews with them because they're not part of the official system. But we do get
Okay.
that. We do get feedback. You know, we make sure we want to always keep improving the system, continuous improvement. But we don't kind of take our communities through an after action process.
Okay. Well, I'll let someone else have a go.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Ian. So Chris will be coming in now, and then after Chris, from the chat, then Andrew Sharrock, if you're maybe able to raise your hand, then I will be able to enable your microphone and camera. Thank you. Chris, go ahead.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, Dan, really inspirational presentation this morning. Hugely impressed by it. I was particularly intrigued, well, not intrigued, but the comment you said about what do you have as opposed to what do you need? And obviously it's a different approach to it. With regard to hubs that may have resources that aren't in demand in there, do you advocate that linking of hubs, or is it always going to be via the sort of responding hub? Sorry, not the hub, the next level up that receives those various points in. And can those resources then be shared wider? That was one question. And the other point, a lot of this has been very much about the response side. And as we all know, the response side tends to be relatively short in comparison to the whole picture, which includes recovery. So do you see these community hubs as being part of the solution to that recovery stage in addition to response? And how would that transition look? I hope that's useful.
Two great questions. Thanks, Christopher. First, yeah, I don't think it's a black and white thing, and that's why in that map I showed some hubs we actually do some joint kind of planning. So a community is there's, you know, most communities don't have hard lines dividing them between community X, you know, the railroad tracks metaphorically. But most people we know there's going to be some interdependencies and intersupport between hubs. We don't try to overly go out of our way to define that too much. We know that there's just that's going to naturally happen. And sometimes we deliberately encourage it, and sometimes we just expect it to happen. So we have built that into the planning depending on how we understand communities X, Y, and Z. Your second question, remind me again.
Sorry, it was on that transition from response to recovery.
Yes.
And are they part of that solution and working mechanism?
Yeah, so there's 6 chapters to the hub guide, and the chapter 6 is basically a page that advises the community, like the challenges are only just beginning if this is a decent event. And so you can go online and check this out yourself. But it's basically a page to say, as you're winding down, like your challenges might just be beginning. Maintain the social capital, look after yourself, coordination, speak as a voice, collective voice for your community to local government, because all that stuff to really position a suburb to think about recovery. So it's not really getting to the household level, but at a community level. Think about this. What kind of things are you going to want to advocate for your community? Blah blah blah. So it's a little bit of a primer. You check that out online.
No, that's great. Thanks for that, Dan. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. So Andrew, if you're able to come on screen, thank you.
Good morning, Dan. Great presentation. Really inspiring and exciting. One of the problems that we've got is we've an army of community groups and volunteers who are doing some fantastic work out in the borough, supporting communities in different ways. But fortunately, we don't have many major incidents to respond to, and it doesn't always help when we use terminology like it was 1 in 100 years flooding event, because they look at you and say, well, I'll not be around when it happens again, it'll not happen again in my lifetime. How do you deal with that type of response to enthuse people to look at setting up community hubs with you?
Yeah, great question. And that gets to the heart of community development right there, right? So one of the things that I think one of my many pet peeves about my own sector is we often talk about like people are just apathetic. And I don't believe people are apathetic. I think they have different priorities, right? And so, as a father of 2 young girls, like I've got a whole stack of priorities, and emergency management isn't one of them, And so how do we speak to our communities the things that matter to them, and piggyback on use the emergency management stuff to piggyback on. So that's why we often talk about how is your community going to work together in times of stress. I often don't. Sometimes we use the disaster narrative. We often talk about other narratives as well to piggyback on what's already working well in the community, the things that they're interested in, and then how can we work together to solve some of these common challenges. So I probably not a straightforward answer to that, but I think making it fun and having a party. People love going to parties, right? Like generally, if I've learned anything in this, people don't like to confront their mortality. So when we talk about death and destruction stuff, it's kind of a buzzkill. But people do like parties, and they do like meeting their neighbors. They do like working together to solve challenges, and that's a lot of how we frame our stuff. We're able to kind of put some of the disaster narrative on there, but we also work with our council community development teams. And I think the example I showed was the Offuto Bay one. In that picture, they were having a big Halloween event, and so we just piggybacked on their Halloween party, and then we told people they'd have an opportunity to act ridiculous and dress up and role play. And so we just try to make it as fun as possible. And I guess on the volunteer element, we've moved from calling our folks volunteers to community champions. So we have about half a dozen champions at every suburb, generally, I'd say plus or minus. And those folks know that they might not be running, they might not be in charge. We took us a little while to unwind some of the you're going to be running it. They see themselves now as helping lift the whole of the community. Whoever's going to come in, they're going to be kickstarting it, and that's a really important shift that took us a little while, but it's just worth its weight in gold now, because those people are amazing. We love them. But they also know they might not be running it. They're keeping the fire kind of warm, on the slow burn.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. So Helen, Ray, I've enabled your camera and microphone, and then after Helen, Nathan also had your hand raised, so you'll also be enabled after Helen. So go ahead, Helen, if you're able to come on screen or off mute.
I've come off mute. The question, sorry, was really around the capacity to do the training. So I work for a local authority, and I look after our community hubs. We also have a whole system of community response hubs, which is to do with this kind of thing, sort of reacting, whether it's an emergency or a situation locally. It's a very rural area that we work in. So I'm familiar with the New Zealand model, and we've been working with it for a couple of years now and trying to understand how we could implement that. So we have built up community response hub packs. We have them ready to go out. We have people who are registered, community groups who are registered to do that. We have confirmed with them all that they're happy to self-activate. So that kind of answers the question the lady earlier raised about, if you're asking people to do something. We don't. We say, if you want to be this, you self-activate. You activate when you think there's a need in your community. I think my question's around the capacity. So I love the idea of because it's easy to send somebody a pack and a list of instructions, but I don't think that gets the engagement or the understanding that would be looking at. So your idea of going into a community and doing the role play and explaining it sounds like a great idea, but how do you manage that from a capacity point of view, or do you have a huge team?
No, I don't have a huge team. We have a community resilience approach where we do work programs from a household, business / NGO and community work program. And for each community response practice, we have 40 hours allocated to roll one out. So my team usually spends, a couple weeks in suburb X, working with local leaders, businesses, movers and shakers, elected officials, and then we just do a bunch of advertising. And then, arguably about 35 of those hours is just drinking coffee with folks. And then 5 hours of basically prep for the actual event. The community response practice session usually takes about 2 hours from beginning to end. And that's it. It's pretty straightforward. And I'm happy we've got all the kind of the run sheets and all that kind of stuff that I'd be happy to share.
Oh, great.
If anybody's interested.
Yeah, I'd be really interested in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. So Nathan, obviously you're coming up next, and after Nathan, then David Mitchell, and David, obviously I see I've enabled your camera and microphone as well. But Nathan, go ahead.
Well, thanks, Dan. Yeah, my question is in terms of if the official or government response to an incident is looking to forward deploy assets into that community, do you look to co-locate them next to one of those hubs because that supports co-location and communication, or do you keep them apart in order to differentiate between kind of that spontaneous volunteer and the formal response?
Such a good question. Such a good question. Yeah, we basically would look at, depending, from a deployment of resources. Most of our hubs are at schools. I should probably just touch on this briefly. I think schools make great hubs because they're they're maintained by the government, so they're in good shape. They're agnostic from a point of view of like they're welcome to everybody. Nobody feels generally they're open to everybody. They've got a lot of big open spaces around there for basically dropping off assets, easily accessible, people with disabilities, a whole bunch of benefits. And sometimes people go like, but what happens when school has to get in function? What we have seen is you basically, school's not going to be going if there's a decent event, right? So as long as the event is going, probably school's not going to be there. As soon as school needs to get back in, and the event still requires a community response, you can move it down to some other location. So yes, that's a long-winded answer to yes. We deploy resources to there. We would not run, however, an official kind of evacuation center or what we say is an emergency assistance center. We wouldn't run it at that facility because that would confuse things. And I think there's a real risk of, I love our sector, I've been involved in for a long time, overriding that community response, right? So I think having nearby is really good. So because we offer different services, nearby is really good. Co-locating is super dangerous, and I'd strongly against it. And I've seen it happen, not with this model, but variant, and it's not been great. So I've taken that lesson 12 years on. Great question. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you, Nathan. So, David, obviously you have a comment and question in the chat around inequality. So if you'd like to come off mute, and then after yourself, David, Ruth Stevens, I've enabled your camera and mic. So if you're willing as well. So go ahead, David.
Thanks, Andrew. Morning, everybody. Morning, Dan, or evening in your case. I'm afraid I'm sat here as one of the people who thinks about the communities in which I work, and I'm really wondering where or how some of this is going to apply in a large urban environment with all those things that you mentioned: apathetic communities, dependent communities, serious socioeconomic problems, all those kinds of things. But with want to frame the question in a slightly more positive way. So the question is, there's inequalities out there, whether that's health, socioeconomic, or whatever, and there's a good evidence base that the consequences of emergencies also follow and even exacerbate those inequalities. So I'm wondering about the distribution of your success or otherwise with the community emergency hub concept. Is it the case that they work better in better off areas, while there are communities who won't engage and therefore will be left? And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, another really good question. I don't think there's a straight kind of black and white answer to that. We've seen, I think, in lower socioeconomic communities where people are dealing with emergencies every day, right? Yeah. We have not probably had the level of engagement that we have in other areas. And so we're really conscious of again, knowing the community that we're working in and modifying our approaches to work in those communities. One of the things that I think my team has done a little bit over the years is we've learned to work with a lot of the NGOs that are working often in that community, and they often know those communities best, right? So that's another way that we've kind of drawn on what the capacity and capabilities are and the assets, et cetera, et cetera. And my team has probably had to lean a little bit more than they would, and there's a bit of a balancing act there, and it's not as straightforward and does require more work. But what we have learned is a lot of those communities still are very rich in resources once you start unpacking it. It's just the people that are willing to come and show up aren't. It's a little bit harder, and I think a lot of that is because they're dealing with emergencies every day, right? And the possible abstract future emergency isn't top of priority.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much, David. So obviously Ruth Stevens, if you're willing to come on, but before, just obviously I'm conscious of time, and I know David Paul will be coming in then to close. So I think we've probably only an opportunity for one further question after Ruth. So if you've got a really burning question that hasn't been covered in terms of Dan's answers, then please raise your hand and we can bring you in after Ruth. So Ruth, go ahead.
Yeah, to be honest, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, to be honest, the question before mine pretty much answered it, what I was after, really. Like I said, we've gone into our communities, similar projects, same but different in regards to community resilience, and I think it's just dealing with that negativity sometimes, and dealing with that backlash and that pushback regards to what you're trying to achieve, and the attitude that why are we doing this? It should be the emergency services. I work for local authority. I'm an emergency planner, by the way, but it's just like how probably just a couple more examples of how you've managed to turn that around in some areas.
Yeah, and I guess that's part of why we've opened up increasingly with the system is not as robust as you think it is, and we will not be able to meet your needs like you probably think we can, and your community response will be a lot more important than you probably have realized, and that has been at times a little bit difficult for I think our sector, because I think we've done ourselves, at least I think here in New Zealand and maybe other parts of the world, a disservice by over promoting our capability. I think we've done that here, at least in New Zealand. And so having honest conversations saying, when we have emergency events, you are going to be your community response, you are part of the emergency management system. You are an emergency manager. And this is how it's going to be playing out. We have been on a 10-year journey in many respects to reset expectations with our communities, and we haven't cracked that nut. I mean, there's still plenty of people that would expect the emergency, big earthquake and the emergency management officer from council to come knocking 15 minutes after to see if they're okay. There's still plenty of people, but we do know, because we do annual surveys of community preparedness, that 36% of people in the Wellington region know the purpose of a community emergency hub and where their local one is. And I'm pretty content that journey that we've been on for the last several years is making inroads in reshaping expectations that we won't be able to meet people's needs in a large event, and that their best resources is their community around them, and they actually know where their hub is and what to do. And I think that's just a multi-year journey of kind of unwinding expectations. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Ruth. Thank you very much. So, I wonder, Michael Kroemans, apologies for my pronunciation. Michael, obviously you have a question in the chat, so if you're able to raise your hand and I see it now, I can. So this will be the final question of the session before I hand it over to David Powell. So Michael, you should be able to So calling from the Netherlands, I presume, Michael. Are you able to come off mute? Michael, can... No, I'm afraid I don't hear Michael, so apologies about that. So, David, maybe we can hand over to you. And obviously, Michael has placed his question in the chat. So, obviously, Dan, when you get a moment, you might be able to have a look.
Do we know what that is?
David, yeah, so it's just towards yeah, nope. Yeah, so it's so really inspirational. So Michael's question was around then a set of best practices for getting started. What are the prerequisites, planning, etc., to get the first few hubs established?
Great question. One, I think make sure you have a team that has good community development principles like we talked about. If I were to start this from scratch, my advice, and we're advising on other cities around New Zealand now, is to get a GIS team and really kind of understand what it takes to where ideally you'd be locating these, because we kind of did this as a grandfathered old civil defense center model and repurposed them with a different name that meant was more relevant to people. But I'd be getting my GIS team to really map out. Generally, our guidance is nobody should have to walk more than 30 minutes to access a hub at a suburb level. Longer at a rural, but at a suburb level, nobody should have to walk more than 30 minutes. So that's kind of our general guideline, and it's generally hazard agnostic too, because it could be any type of event, right? So hope that helps.
Hi, Michael. We can obviously see you now, but you're still mute. I think apologies, Michael, but I think we'll just hand over to David at this point, and obviously we can follow up then if you have a more specific question. So David, please go ahead.
Okay, Andrew, thank you. Gosh, where to start, Dan? Thank you very much. It's an obvious place. I've been doing a words cloud, by the way, while you've been talking, and I can tell you the word inspirational has appeared about 12 times and it's the dominant word that's come through. So, thank you. I'm delighted that people have found it equally inspiring the way that Duncan and I, and increasingly Andrew, have done over the last 6 months that we've been talking. So, yeah, massive thank you. Really great to hear from your words rather than our language, that encouragement for people to start letting control a little bit of the system and start to trust the ability of communities to solve problems using what they've got themselves locally. But the one that I really want people to take away is that reinforcement you make very well, Dan, about the importance of community development skills as a precursor. You can't just pick up your model and hope to throw it at a community. You've got to do a lot of thinking. And I think what you've been particularly good at inspiring is people to think about that fun engagement and how you build on the positives of community before you get into some of the planning stuff. And obviously from our point of view, we love the idea that it's time to just rethink how we might structure the way we do that going forward here in the UK as we try to get into societal resilience. I'm hoping we'll continue to have many conversations, Dan, because we'd be delighted to carry on working with you, trying to help globalize the model, because I think even chats from all over the place, not just the UK, it's clearly resonating much further afield than New Zealand, Australia, America, UK. There's a bigger audience for it, I think. And then finally, if you'll forgive me for the plug, here in the UK, we've converted the material from New Zealand and we put it into a context for the United Kingdom system. We're going to launch that formal module on the 20th of June for the consortium members, the National Consortium for Societal Resilience, at what point we'll make all the material available. We'll continue to have conversations, Dan, hopefully about maybe doing a couple of online training sessions, specifically around the community development skills. And it'd be great to hear a little bit more about the philosophy that you shared earlier on, the model. From that work, Dan, where they're going to do a little bit more work on spontaneous volunteers, and again, trying to refresh that here in the UK along similar lines. But I just wanted to stop there, I think, and say a massive thank you it's been great fun, actually, one, to meet you and then to work with you and listen to your unique style, I think, of delivery, which goes down very well wherever I've heard you speak. So a massive thank you to me, a great thank you to Andrew, Duncan and the rest of the team at the University of Manchester. And thank you very much for all of you who joined in today, listened in and contributed to the chat. Have a great day. Dan, have a really lovely evening for what's left of it.
Hey,
thank you.
Thank you all for listening. It's really fun. Appreciate it. And we're always happy to help.
Thanks all. Cheers.